Welcome. This is the Health and Wellness Coach Journal podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jessica Singh, the founder and CEO of the Center for Health and Wellness Coaches. This is a podcast for coaches to explore topics related to health, wellness, and coaching, sharing knowledge and sharing light. Dean is a licensed therapist and success coach with over 35 years of experience, a best-selling author, and highly sought-after speaker, a two-time cancer survivor, and a two-time world record-setting extreme distance swimmer. He is the first person in history to swim the entire 187-mile length of Oregon's longest river, the Willamette River, which he did as an active cancer patient in 2014, and Ireland's longest river, the River Shannon, which is 180 miles in 2017. Dean's unexpected radical remission from his cancers as a result of his immersive adventures in nature inspired him to create his organization, The Wild Cure Way. His mission is to help individuals leave behind the confines of concrete jungles and digital distractions to rediscover the transformative healing power of nature. As the creator of Natura, a pioneering wellness evaluation that blends nature immersion, adopted therapeutic techniques, and AI innovation, he provides personal pathways to holistic well-being. Through Natura, participants are empowered to embrace the wild waters and open spaces in their part of the world as profound sources of healing for mind, body, and spirit. Welcome, Dean.
Hey, thank you, Jessica. I'm really excited to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. What a journey you've had.
Yeah. It's so funny because after I give a speech or people contact me and they'll just say, "Oh, I love your story. Wasn't it such an adventure? Wasn't it so much fun?" I don't know how to answer that. What about almost dying 3 times, having cancer, losing my wife, or even swimming for 22 days, 10 to 12 hours a day in 40-degree water? What part of that sounds fun? It's really fun to look back on it now that we know that there was this really unexpected, successful outcome. But most of the time, I didn't think there would be. I just thought I was a goner and my life was over and I'd lost a lot and I was just going to go out swinging for the fence. But most of it was very unfun. Yeah.
Dean, I know you're such a seasoned speaker and your book is wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you.
But I was wondering, just for the listeners maybe who aren't familiar with your journey yet, can you share your story with us?
Sure. I grew up here in Oregon. I had what I consider an idyllic childhood. I was the son of 2 mountain climbers. My mom got front page of the sports page in 1952 for climbing Mount Hood because women in those days were supposed to just wear pearls, I guess, and stay home. And she was out there conquering and summiting mountains. And so I talked to her now and she's like, "Oh, I just didn't want to be left behind." But that's her being very modest. She's tougher than all of us, I'm pretty sure. And so in the 60s and 70s, out here in the Cascades, there wasn't Instagram or social media. Most people didn't come out here unless they were adventurers. It was very pristine still. And so it wasn't unusual for us to be out 4 or 5 days and not see another person and get to places where people maybe hadn't been for years. And so it was just this wonderful adventure for me, and maybe explains why I returned to that later in life. But all I wanted to be as a child is a sponsored adventurer or mountain climber for National Geographic because my parents had some friends that actually were, and it really inspired me. But then soccer took over, and I became completely obsessed by it. And I saw an old guy wearing a T-shirt not long ago that said, "The older I get, the better I was." And it kind of describes my whole soccer career. But I did get on the first Nike sponsored team, and they took us over to England, and we played under Manchester United and Liverpool and Wolverhampton, their reserve teams, which was a real important experience for me because I just thought I was the best of the best, being 16 years old. And I got over there, and those guys were so skilled and so good that they made us look like Bobo the Dancing Bear. And so it was a real great lesson in humility. But I had soccer scholarships all over the U.S. And on a lark, I picked a small college in Kansas because I was a real history nerd and I was obsessed with the Civil War. And so much of the Civil War, you kind of have to be a history nerd to know, so much of the Civil War erupted in Kansas. And then it's got Dodge City and all these places I'd only heard about. And so I thought, I'll go and play for this tiny little college and just spend all my weekends traveling to historical sites, which I did. But I didn't know I'd also meet this cute little Kansas farm girl who, once we fell in love, said, I'd love to marry you. I'd love to spend the rest of my life with you, but I'm really close to my family. I'm not going back to Oregon just because I'm in love with you, which you got to appreciate her honesty. And so I came back for a while, and then I just was so enamored and goofy about her. I told all my friends I was putting myself in exile for love. And if you've ever been to Kansas, that's pretty much it. So I went there and tried to develop a really good life with her, and did. I taught art in a middle school for 18 years, and then the last 10 of which I went back and got my master's in marriage and family therapy and my license as a therapist, and spent 10 years just building private practice in that tiny little town 4 miles north of the Oklahoma border, and developed a really good life. I built a thriving practice. I was writing an advice column for several newspapers around the U.S., just having a great time. Wrote a book on date rape prevention, and it was starting to really go well. And I was starting to work with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, because what I noticed and brought to their attention was, they were getting people home safely, at least their bodies, but they weren't doing enough to prevent date rape happening at these parties. And so I developed something I called the DD Plus, somebody that is designated driver person looking for unsafe situations, because I found that if they took somebody, the designated driver, watched for when these girls got drunk, the sharks would circle and try to isolate them. And if they made sure they weren't isolated, it really kept them safe. And so a lot of wonderful things were happening. And then I got diagnosed with leukemia the first time, and it was a shock. I'd never really been sick in my life. I'd always been healthy and happy. And after my soccer career was over, I launched into doing triathlons because there were no mountains to climb. So I had to do something, and always been very fit. And I had gotten so hurt my last year in college, had a just terrible accident with my knee where I'd hyperextended it, actually kicked my own self in the head with my own foot, that I'd been waiting on a total knee replacement for 20 years. And finally I was old enough where I wouldn't have to do it again. And I took a blood test, a pre-surgical blood evaluation. And you'll get a kick out of this being a doctor. They called me up and said, "Dean, your blood test came back bad." It never occurred to me that that meant something was wrong with me. I taught in this small town so long that a lot of the kids that I taught were now in entry-level positions. And so the person who'd drawn my blood had been a student of mine way back years before as a little sixth grader. And she was just adorable. And I didn't want her to get in trouble. I just assumed she'd done something wrong and had fouled the test. And so I said, "Oh, that's okay. Don't get anybody in trouble." And the nurse said, what? And I said, huh? And she's like, no, just come back in. I said, yeah, that's fine. I'll make time. It's okay with me. I just don't want anybody getting fired over this. And she said, what? She's like, no, just come back in. And so I did. And this time they took several more vials. Another student did it. And I said, just be really careful. I don't want you to get in trouble. And they looked like it still didn't occur to me that something was wrong with me until that night. My doctor, who was also, it's a small town, so he'd become one of my best friends because he'd done a lot of referrals to me and we'd really gotten to know each other. And he would come in about once or twice a month at about 9 or 10 p.m. after we were both done working. And since I'm also a certified clinical hypnotherapist, I would do some grounding and some release work with him to help him de-stress. Well, I thought that's why he'd come in. And I said, hey, Aaron, what can I do for you? And he just looked like he'd been shot. He looked white as a sheet. And I said, are you okay? And he's like, well, no. I said, well, what can I do for you? And he's like, it's not what you can do for me. It's what I got to tell you. I thought, oh, no, he's in trouble. He's probably being sued or something. And he told me that my blood test had come back bad, that I have leukemia, and they'd never seen anything like it before. He'd called in some favors and had 2 world-class oncologists look at it, and even they'd never seen it before. I had features of both acute and chronic, and my numbers were escalating in the hundreds of thousands every day. And if that didn't turn around, I only had 4 to 6 weeks to live. And my first thought, Jessica, I was in such shock. My first thought was, oh, good, Aaron's okay. And then it was like, wait a minute. No, I'm not okay. And my daughter was 14 at the time. And I don't know if you've been around 14-year-old girls, but they need their dads as far as I'm concerned. And so for the first 2 weeks, I just walked around in a daze. And then, thankfully, my leukemia went over toward chronic, which meant it bought us some time. But then all of 2006, I was really sick. And then 2008, my immune system was still so suppressed that I almost died of pneumonia. I woke up in the hospital not knowing how I'd gotten there. And this same doctor was standing over me looking at the IV, and he looked scared. And we'd been through a lot together. And I'd never seen him look scared, no matter what we'd been through together in emergency situations. That concerned me, and I was surprised that I was in the hospital and didn't know how I'd gotten there. And so I said, hey, what's going on? And he's like, oh, you're back. And I said, yeah. And I said, what's going on? And he's like, well, you passed out at home, and we got you here, and it's not good. I said, well, you look scared. And he's like, no, I'm not scared. And I said, Aaron, I know you look scared. It's like, okay, you almost died. And he's like, you're going to have to fight. You're going to have to do something. You're going to have to give this your best. And I said, well, I can do that. And so I did, and I was really sick. But then by late 2008, I really turned around. And I did really well for the rest of 2008, all 2009. 2010, I felt like I'd really been through a storm, but we'd learned a lot of lessons. I drastically changed my lifestyle. I'm so ADHD. All I'd ever really needed was about 3 or 4 hours sleep. So I never really slept my whole life. Used to drive my parents crazy. Worked out really good for college, though, because, I could have a great time and get up at 1 a.m. and do my homework till about 3 or 4 and then go to sleep, and I'm fine. So I never had to miss out on any of the fun in college. But I started forcing myself to get 8 or 9 hours of sleep a night. I started eating much better. I started watching my stress. I'd had 2 jobs from the time I was 15, literally 2 jobs, a couple times, 2 full-time jobs from the time I was 15 to the time I was 42. I was always busy. And I really tried to balance some of that. And I started really becoming much more aware of tension and stress I was holding in my body, which was a lot more than, because my generation of men had been taught to be tough guys and ignore anything emotional or even physical. And so I became much more attuned to that. Started meditating an hour a day or more. all these lifestyle protocols I changed. So we thought that cancer had really taught us a lesson and everything was fine. And moving forward, my book was starting to really do well. And then August of 2010, really late July of 2010, Mary got sick. At first, they thought that she had pneumonia, which wasn't unusual in Kansas during the summer because there's so much wheat dust in the air. But she just was not acting like herself. And then by August, the right side of her face fell. And at first, they thought she had Meniere's disease or something. And then she started to garble her speech. So we took her in and got a brain scan. And Aaron called me up. And he's like, man, are you sitting down? And I'm like, no. And he said, we got to meet. So we met. And he said, it's one of the largest brain tumors I've ever seen. I'm calling in some favors. One of the top 5 neurosurgeons up in Kansas City. And Aaron was on the KU Board of Medicine, so he had all sorts of really good contacts. He's like, I'm going to get you in with him as soon as possible. But he's like, it looks bad. And so 2 days later, we were up in Kansas City, which was a 6.5 hour drive up there. And by then, Mary wasn't walking. So I had to wheel her in. And he looked up at the film and he's like, could you wheel her back out to the waiting room? I need to talk to you. And I thought, wow, this can't be good. And he said, Dean, I'm so sorry. He said, it's one of the largest brain tumors I've ever seen. It's got all sorts of fingers going into her brain, and neurosurgery is successful with brain tumors to the extent that they're high in the brain and forward. Hers is all the way back and down around her brain stem with all sorts of ganglia. If we did laser guided surgery, there's an 80% chance we'll nick a blood vessel and she'll bleed out on the table, or we'll nick a nerve and she'll be a quadriplegic the rest of her life. Still the ever-present optimist. I said, well, what if everything goes right? He said, well, the best we can hope for is getting 50% of the tumor. And I said, what would we do then? And he said, you'd go down to MD Anderson and go through a lot of chemo and radiation. And I said, would she have a good life expectancy then? And he said, no, it'd probably only buy her about 6 months. And I said, well, what would her life be like that 6 months? And he said, well, imagine the worst migraine and the flu all at the same time. I said, well, that's no way to live. What if we don't do anything? And he said, well, if you don't do anything, this is increasing so quickly. She'll continue to sleep more, lose her capabilities more, and she'll die in her sleep. And I asked him if she'd be in a lot of pain, and he said he didn't think so. Usually they weren't. And he said she probably only had about 6 months to a year. And 52 days later, she was dead, 15 days for our 30th anniversary. Looking back on it now, I understand, that kind of loss is pretty traumatic for anyone because we'd been together since we were 19, got married just before my 21st birthday. But insidiously now, I see why it was so devastating. My living in that small town, to be an insider, it was only 12,000 people in this town, and that was on a good day, and if you count all the dogs and cats. But if your grandparents really don't grow up there, you're an outsider. And so for 30 years, even though I taught there, even though I'd been a therapist there, people see me out in public, they'd say, oh, there's Mary's husband. I was never Dean. And at first that was a little annoying, but I got used to it, and it was a good gig. I didn't mind. But I didn't realize how that had formed my whole adult identity. So when Mary was gone, I really didn't know who I was because I was Mary's husband. And staying in that little town, even though I had a thriving practice and that's where all my adult friends were, I tried to for 2 years, but it was like living in a fishbowl with every brick, every tree, every person having a memory of Mary. I knew that I would just have to put a timestamp on my life and continue to be that sad guy who used to be Mary's husband. I knew that it would not be any way to live. So I sold my practice, sold my home, and moved back to Oregon thinking that would be the answer. But then for the first time in 30 years, I was renting and in a tiny little duplex and with no friends except for my family. And so I really had isolated myself and become very alone. And by 2013, I was dying of leukemia and lymphoma. We're finding a lot of research now where a year after a tragedy, cancer comes back. And almost to the day in 2011, a year later, leukemia came back with a vengeance and brought with it lymphoma. And I really didn't care. And by August of 2013, I was down to 152 pounds. I'm 6'1", and usually what I call my fighting weight, even though I don't fight. But when I'm really trim, I'm about 2'8", 210. So 152, I was skeletal. And the lymphoma had ravaged. I had over 70 swollen lymph nodes, at least that we could count and see. And two of the biggest were right under my jawline. They were just swollen so huge they disfigured me. And then I had about 20 or 30 right under my collarbone, and then one under my right arm. My doctor called my hockey puck because it was the size and shape of a hockey puck. I was done for by 2013. And that's basically my sad tale of woe. That's all the things that came up to a very critical point in my life.
Just want to pause, honor everything that you've just shared.
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it? And I cut out about 70% of it. Because in that time, between 2007 and 2013, there were 3 times I woke up in the hospital. And the doctor's like, whoa, you almost didn't make it. We called your family. And I feel kind of cheated because everybody that has that story got to talk to their grandma or saw a pillar of light or had some spiritual near-death experience. And I know all I did was I felt really bad or didn't even know I was in the hospital, and then woke up to a team of doctors and nurses working over me. And one of the times was especially bad in 2012 to try to prove to my daughter I was still strong. We hadn't yet moved back to Oregon, and so we went on a vacation down to the border of southern Arkansas and Oklahoma, and I swam 1.5 miles across this lake to show my daughter I was still strong, not knowing that I was swimming through blue-green algae. And 2 days later, I was passed out, and she had to take me to the emergency room, and I'd gotten viral meningitis. When I woke up, I'd lost 50 to 60 pounds, had lesions and scabs all over my body, even on my tongue. I didn't know you could get scabs on your tongue. And so I woke up and I saw this skinny, odd-looking monster that didn't look like me. And then, because it was a small Oklahoma hospital, we had to wait 5 days to find out if it was viral meningitis or herpetic meningitis. If it had been herpetic meningitis, I would have lost my mind and only had a 10-second memory. I felt like I'd lost everything, and I had to wait 5 days to find out if I was going to lose my mind too. That was probably the real low point. Yeah. You know you're at a low point when you're celebrating that you got viral meningitis. Oh, man.
I know you said that there are so many of these points, and you had just mentioned that turning point for you in 2014. Mm-hmm. What was the turning point?
I had 2 that were just, every time I talk about them, I still get chills. The first one, a lot of people don't know, but I'd known as a therapist for quite some time. The research came out that the brain by its very nature has to answer every question you ask. And we've all experienced that. We'll think, what was that guy's name? Or when did George Washington do, we'll think of some trivial thing. And then an hour or 2 later, we'll be brushing our teeth and the answer will come. Well, the reason that happens is because the unconscious has been working to answer that question because it can't stand unanswered questions. It has to tie up every knot, and it can't leave anything at loose ends. what a lot of people don't know, but what I've realized in my own personal life is that works not just for trivia, but for the deepest questions of your life. And so in 2013, I was dying. I knew I was dying. And for the first time, I wasn't really clinically suicidal, but I just didn't care. I thought, you know what? I think I'm done fighting. I think I'm just going to let cancer take me. Nobody will have known, it won't be a suicide, but I've accomplished everything I ever wanted to accomplish. I had a nice long-term love relationship. I've had a wonderful parenting experience with my daughter, who at that time was now 21. I've written a book. I've published other things. I had, I think, a positive impact on the world. I taught thousands of kids and treated thousands of people in therapy. I'm done. I'm good. And then I thought, yeah, okay, but it's not about you, buddy. Your daughter just lost her mom. You really not going to give her your best. And so I knew that kind of thought was entirely selfish. And I like to think of myself as not a selfish person, especially when it comes to my daughter. So I knew I had to do something. And so I started asking, what could I give my life to and become passionate about again? Because I had helped many people come back using Viktor Frankl's work. He wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. He was an Austrian psychiatrist, and he'd been sent to Auschwitz. And so he found that the more passionate you were about a purpose, the greater chance you had to overcome horrible circumstances. I realized, yeah, I'd been through some things in life. And so quit feeling too sorry for yourself. So I decided to start asking every day, several times a day, prayerfully. I just really breathe and just with my whole mind and body ask, what would be the best use of the time I have left on earth? And then I'd let it go. I'd done this kind of thing before, pre-cancer, and the longest I'd ever had to wait was 2 or 3 days. Longest I'd ever seen anyone wait, as I'd have clients do it, is about 2 weeks. Well, 6 weeks later, it's still crickets. And one day I was doing this with all my heart and mind, and I opened my eyes a little frustrated that I hadn't heard any great mystical answer. And I looked around my duplex, and I'd been so depressed. It's probably bad that I admit this, but I'd been living there for 6 months and I hadn't even unpacked. It looked like a frat house. It was really not my typical lifestyle. And so I thought, okay, Dean, while you wait for the universe to answer, maybe you could act like a responsible adult and at least put your bed together so you're not sleeping on a mattress on the floor, for goodness sake. And so I started doing that. And then I went to open a box. And one of the first boxes I opened had a journal that I'd been forced to keep when I was 11. And that was the first real gift. I looked at that. I'd forgotten I'd even been forced, because when I was 11, I was not going to keep a journal. I had to do it as a matter of class. And so I opened it up, and the first is typical 11-year-old Dean. When I get old, I gotta climb Mount Everest, swim the English Channel. And as soon as I thought about it, those goosebumps came through me. It was like an electric shot. I'd forgotten the boy that I'd been, and how all I'd wanted was adventures around the world, and how I'd sacrificed those in name of responsibility and being a good citizen and being a good husband and working hard and building a career and mostly doing a lot of things I never wanted to do and that weren't even essentially or authentically, honestly me. I was just trying to make my wife happy and be a good man and get a nice house and a nice car and all sorts of stuff that neither one of us probably ever needed. And I accomplished those things, but at what price? And so it brought me back to that Dean, that intrinsic person that I think was at my core all along. And maybe even a little bit quietly frustrated, but I never would have admitted that even to myself. And immediately I knew I couldn't climb Everest because my immune system was so wrecked. my blood counts probably wouldn't handle elevation. And even though it was just a year past the whole viral meningitis swimming, that never occurred to me until I called Dr. Waters Aaron, that buddy of mine. It never occurred to me that swimming might be a problem again. But I'm like, but I can swim the channel. So I Googled any active cancer patient to have swum the entire length of the English Channel. No active cancer patient ever had. So I thought, okay, now I can do something that would be super cool that I've wanted to do all my life, but it doesn't have to be about me. It could be about a bigger purpose. If an active cancer patient swims the English Channel, it shows the world that you can still do things and have a life and have goals and dreams, even though you've got that diagnosis hanging over your head. It might teach the world of cancer patients you don't have to be defined by your diagnosis. And so I was into that and getting really excited about it. But I made the mistake of telling that doctor and my adventurer parents, and all of them told me I was nuts, that I'd lost my mind, that's the dumbest thing they'd ever heard. And so I was feeling a little defeated. Right that next day, as I was defeated, I opened up my laptop, and there on the Yahoo homepage, they used to always have quotes. And it was a quote by Einstein. And Einstein said, there are only two ways to live your life. One is as if nothing is a miracle. The other is as if everything's a miracle. And it hadn't really occurred to me that finding the journal was a miracle yet. And my life was still so wrecked that I actually cussed Einstein out. And I thought there's no way he could have known everything I'd been through. And I slammed my laptop shut. But then it was what I call a Velcro quote, Jessica. It just stuck to my brain. And then I realized, oh, this is part of the answer I'd been asking for. And so I made a 2-week trial run commitment to it. I'm going to pretend everything's a miracle or a miracle in the making. And within 2 days, it had radically changed my life. I wasn't feeling so much like a victim. I wasn't so depressed. If everything was a miracle, what was I missing? It opened and expanded my view to the point where it wasn't all just about me and everything that I'd lost. It was about what could this be leading to? And then I thought it was pretty easy to see that it was leading to the swim. I didn't know why. Maybe to inspire other people. And so those two things were just kind of a 1-2 beautiful dance step by the universe that led me to every good thing after. Yeah.
How do you feel like swimming played a role in your healing?
Well, first, it gave me something to think about, a purpose, something to focus on, even while I was training. But I swam the entire length of the Willamette River in 2014. It took me 22 days. I averaged 10 to 12 miles a day. That doesn't sound very impressive unless you're a swimmer and know that a marathon in an Ironman, full distance Ironman, is 3.3 miles. So I was doing 3 to 4 marathons a day every day for 22 days. Yeah, that puts it a little more in context. But then you also find out that the Willamette is largely a snowmelt river. So even in June, the first 16 days, the water temperature is between 42 and 45 degrees. And unless you're experienced at getting in water, 45 degrees doesn't sound that cold unless you're in it. Most people get a startle response right at around 58 degrees. They think that's freezing. And so you turn it down even more. It's really cold. And I was immersed in that for 10 or so hours a day for the first 16 days. And then thankfully, it came up to 52 degrees. Man, that felt like a sauna. It was so nice. But even with the 3 mil wetsuit, I was having to get out. This was my day, and this is what cracks me up. My dad thinks it's so funny because he's heard several people say, oh, that must have been so much fun. But he watched it because he was my guide boater. And he was like, people are crazy, Dean. because a lot of times it was raining, it was muddy, it was cold, and I would go into fairly deep hypothermia called thrombosis, where my internal organs would start banging against my rib cage, and I'd start slurring my words. He'd ask me a question, and if I couldn't say it without slurring, he's like, it's time to get out. And we found pretty predictably that happened every 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how hard I was having to swim. And so then I'd have to get out and do jumping jacks and run in place to warm back up and then get back in and do it all over again. And I was doing that all day for 22 days. I thought that's why nobody'd ever swum the Willamette. I thought, well, this makes sense. It's not only hard, it's a little bit of torture. If you want to accomplish what nobody's ever accomplished, you got to be willing to do what nobody's ever done. And so I thought, this makes sense. This is hard, but I signed up for it. This is just one of those things I'm going to have to bear. I'd never heard of Wim Hof. I didn't hear of Wim Hof till almost 2015. I didn't even know Instagram was a thing until 2017 or 18. People weren't cold plunging. I'd never read any research. A lot of the research wasn't out yet even. But looking back on it now, so much, and the more we learn about nature, at first we just thought it was the first time I ever heard it connected. Well, I should tell your listeners what happened. The first blood test I took after the swim, the successful end of my swim, the leukemia was miraculously gone. And I was going down to the world's number 3 chronic lymphocytic leukemia researcher, Dr. Juanerio Castro at University of California, San Diego, at their CLL Research Center. And he was just a really kind, wonderful man. He would spend a lot of time with me. And he was just floored. He had been doing it for 30 years and one of the world's leading researchers. And he said he'd never seen anything like it. And as best he could guess, it was that constant cold water. And I was like, really? Why? And he told me how it accessed my brown fat and that it boosted my immune system and poured serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, norepinephrine, all sorts of wonderful feel-good chemicals. And that explained why I was always so happy during the swim. But he explained all those scientific things to me, and I said, oh, great, can I quote you on it? And he said, absolutely not. But I guess I have anyway ever since, and I haven't heard from him. So, yeah, it wasn't just some hack doctor that wasn't in the know. He thinks that's what happened. But now that we're learning more about nature, I didn't hear about grounding or earthing till a couple of years ago. And I was grounded the entire time, and now we know what happens in sunlight. But then there's also something called the blue mind that they're using for PTSD. They found neurologically we're all hardwired to water. It doesn't matter age, gender, race, anything. If you're human, within about 2 minutes, if you're in, on, around, by water, your brain goes down to a rest state. And when people ask me, how was I able to swim so far every day? I tell them it became like this lucid, dreamlike state, kind of just this meditation. I hate to sound cheesy and say I got in the flow, but that's what I was just flowing with and feeling the river. It became this really nice dance between me and Mama River. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful experience. So that's how I would say cold affected and the swim healed me. It was not even close to anything I ever expected. I was just trying to do this thing to have something to concentrate on. I really suspected, as did Dr. Castro, that this might kill me or at least put me in a position where we'd have to do chemo. We had chemo and radiation planned for right after the swim, but my blood showed I didn't need it. And so we thought it was going to have the exact opposite results. But I didn't want to spend my last few days on Earth sitting watching Wheel of Fortune or something, or just laying there miserable in a hospital bed. If I was going to die, I wanted to die doing something worthwhile.
So eloquently stated. And, the traditional medicine way or traditional, not referring to Eastern and holistic medicine, just allopathic medicine, basically.
Right.
I guess for a lot of the coaches, healthcare providers listening to this, as coaches, what your story has made so resoundingly clear is the power of the will to live and how that's so necessary for survival, like you mentioned, overcoming challenges.
Mm-hmm.
As coaches, also, we're supposed to integrate ourselves into the healthcare team, right? Not give medical advice or any of that stuff.
Right.
But what do you do when someone's purpose, like your purpose, you wanted to swim, I told you were crazy or it might kill you. You made a choice that you accepted responsibility for. It happened to heal and do miracles. How would you feel, I guess, is one of the biggest challenges between balancing that will to live and, living whatever days we have on earth in the way that we want to versus recommendations? Sometimes it's hard to balance what our medical system says and what our will to live is. And sometimes, unfortunately, as you know better, those conversations are not had to the extent that they should.
Right. Yeah, I think two answers for that. The first thing, one of the big things that happened with thinking that all of life is a miracle, it occurred to me how much we've been brainwashed to fight cancer. Well, I grew up in the 60s. The way guys solved conflict was with a fist fight. So I had some of that experience as a boy, thankfully not as a man. I gave up those ways. But it occurred to me, that's nuts. It's not a fair fight. One of the things I did as a boy is I always sized up the other guy to see if it was a fair fight or to see if I was going to get beat up. And I fought cancer for 5 years and really fought it hard. And that's all the advice anybody ever gave me. And it's not a fair fight. Plus, it keeps you in that fight or flight state, which is not a healing state for the mind or body. And so when I decided to switch to believing everything's a miracle, it opened and expanded my view to two things. Number one, first thing I had to do is trade fighting cancer for loving life. And how could I love life while I was alive? And that changed the way I looked at my treatment. It gave me the other thing that I tell all of my clients to do, and anybody I can find that's a cancer patient. It's so scary when you're fighting for your life and you're told that you're going to die. Well, guess what? We all are anyway. But you've got to stay in the driver's seat. You've got to be your own best advocate. So from then on, and how I found Dr. Castro is I had to fire a couple oncologists because I decided from that situation on, when I went in, I would say to them, hey, no disrespect. I'm sure you're smarter than me. You're certainly more educated than I am. But if I die, you probably won't even remember me. If I die, my daughter will, I hope, and the people that care about me. This is my responsibility, not yours. I've got to be the boss of my body, not you. So in sports terms, I'm the manager, you're the coach. I'm going to treat you as my expert consultant, no more. One oncologist was so offended, even though I put it like that to him, and I thought I did it kind of casually, and he threw down his clipboard and walked out. And the nurse came in real nervous, and I said, I guess I need a referral. The next one, he was nice, and I thought I had him, and he says, I don't work that way. You're going to do exactly what I say, or I'm not going to work with you. And he said, there's no other way ethically I can work with you. And I said, really? I know quite a bit about ethics. And he said, nope, that's the way I work. And I said, okay, please give me a referral. And so I kept going. And then my dad, which is really odd, he had CLL. And it's not supposed to be hereditary or anything that can be passed on genetically. But he had had a really good experience with Dr. Castro. And so he said, please go see Dr. Castro. He will treat you with utmost respect. And he did. First time I met him, he spent 2 hours with me. I've rarely had an oncologist spend 20 minutes. Just be your own best advocate. And then when you're in the driver's seat, taking full responsibility for your life, it's easy then if you have a big crazy idea like I did, It's not that much of a leap then to say, no, this is what I'm going to do with the time that I have left. In my case, as I'm finding out is so often, I'm sure you found that it's true too, that will to live, when you make that leap, you might buy yourself some more time. Yeah, you might have a lot longer left than you think. I just didn't want to die, like I said, on a couch watching TV. I also didn't want to die, as I see so many cancer patients do, chasing the cure. Well, if I take this kind of oil and stand on my left foot and do the hokey pokey while I get injected with this vitamin, maybe I'll be fine. They're still fighting, chasing that cure, and they don't even realize it. They're still staying in fight or flight.
Yeah, I have a few of the most traumatic memories I have from my physician training are watching patients on their deathbed and some oncologists running to get chemo right when someone's dying at that last moment, exactly what you described.
Yeah.
And the hard thing is about hearing that is lifestyle medicine. What is it? The American Cancer Society says that 95% of cancers are lifestyle borne, maybe 5% is genetic.
Right.
And in medical education, we don't really get standard education on lifestyle. So it's kind of really difficult just as a physician, especially just to hear, someone say, unless you do exactly what I tell you, when they're not even aware of the influence of the pharmaceutical industry and insurance on the decisions that we've made and the education we've had. Right. And so I know that opens up a whole different conversation. What you said about you being in the driver's seat is one of my biggest takeaways. So thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, well, thank you. I think too, so many of us, especially if we were raised in the 60s, 70s or before, we have what I call the white coat syndrome. I mean, we were trained in our society that the smartest, best, brightest, and kindest people on earth are doctors. And I bought that hook, line, and sinker. But then in the 90s, I had several physicians come and do therapy with me. And hearing how many of these men thought and even how they treated their wives, it kind of took them off their pedestal. So I think it was a little easier for me to approach this difficult time in life and see the man in the white coat, who probably is smarter than I am and definitely more educated, not put them on a pedestal and almost see them as an equal. It was easier for me since I had gotten to hear some of the inside of their lifestyle protocols, or at least poor choices. And so I think it's really important to fight, because when you're in that time and you're feeling powerless, the more powerless any of us become, the more we look for either a hero or a villain. And of course, cancer is the villain. So then we desperately need a hero. Well, the hero's us. We're the only ones truly that can save ourselves. And we've got to remember that in that life-threatening time.
Yes. And always, when you were describing the 60s, medicine was also practiced differently in the 60s, even the 90s, before managed care really influenced and infiltrated everything. And so now, like, that missing piece, that human connection, like you mentioned, just having that doctor spend 2 hours with you, it's so different now. And so I'm so grateful for this and for all the coaching work you do too, because, I feel like coaching maybe used to be more part of the medical equation than it is now with all the other things that physicians have to do. Mm-hmm. So very grateful to you. Thank you. Dean, for listeners listening to this conversation, coaches, healthcare providers, what's your takeaway for them?
Yeah, just know that you don't know unless you've been through it. There's no way you could really know exactly what a person's going through. But even if you don't know, just walking through it with grace and patience and acceptance is so important. I think if I were to tell coaches anything, particularly about the cancer recovery, I have thousands and thousands of times encouraged people to read Kelly Turner's book, Radical Hope. When I've had cancer patients read it, it kind of becomes their matrix, or it gives them real, well-proven lifestyle protocols. They then can attach to something tangible and craft their own plan. So I think that's really important. The other thing that I think is absolutely necessary that my life unexpectedly proves is that I think we're also addicted, depressed, and sick and anxious because we live in these concrete boxes way out of our habitat. Anytime I've had a cancer patient start connecting with nature in his or her way routinely, even if it doesn't change their blood counts and them physically, which I can't say that I've ever had a time where it didn't, within 2 or 3 months, it starts to radically change their physiology. It changes their emotional quality. It's all nature connection is really good for anxiety, for mood, for PTSD. One of the things I found when I started going out every Thursday night to spend 24 hours out in nature, I did this for my lymphoma because of the research I read on force bathing by Dr. King Lee from Nippon University. I had, in the 5 years since my wife had died, I cried myself to sleep, but I'd never woke up crying. And starting the first time I stayed out in the wilderness by myself, I woke up crying, which really surprised me. And I knew the body needed to release, so I just let it. And it did that every time. I think a lot of it was the PTSD that just needed to decompress. And my body just needed to let go of so much that had happened those years and even throughout my life. And what your listeners and coaches need to know is that nature has always been there. It has the answers. Science is now starting to point us and our medical practices back to that. And so I would really encourage them to encourage their clients, even if they're not sick, to find some way to weekly connect with nature, if not daily.
Thank you so much. And thanks for mentioning Dr. Turner's book, Radical Hope. I highly recommend the Radical Remission Project too, and the fact that you can go to their website and find cases. And it's a wonderful resource for coaches and doctors. For those listening, I don't have my hard copy because we're moving, but I do want to put up the Wild Cure Dean's book, just a shout out for anyone interested in a deeper dive into his journey. And Dean, thank you so much for your time today.
Jessica, thank you so much for having me on. And anything I can ever do to help you in your mission, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you and value your feedback. So please subscribe and write a constructive review. If you'd like to be informed of new episodes and offerings and resources for coaches, sign up for our email list at www.centerforhealthandwellnesscoaches.com. Sending you warmth and light.